up, and I gave an illustration from mathematics of two principles. Some things are valid, that is, we use mathematics, which is really just a form of, considered to be a form of logic, and we used it, and we had the valid process. We wanted the sum of the ages of Joe and Sue, two hypothetical young people, and we wanted their ages. And so we looked at them, and we looked at the valid process to get the sum of their ages was to add the ages of each one. And then we had two factors that can make it right or wrong. We had to use the proper process, which in our case was addition, and we had to use the right or correct ages. We had to have accurate or correct information. So there are two aspects of these arguments regarding the ages of Joe and Sue that we just covered last week. First, there's a factual claim about the ages of Joe and Sue. What age are they, in fact? And second, there's an inferential claim about the relationship between these claims. The claim about the sum of their ages. And the inference is they have to be added to get the sum. Hurley gives a good summary of these two relationships in the basic of logical argumentation. We have seen that every argument makes two basic claims. A claim that evidence exists, and a claim that the alleged evidence supports something. Right? The evaluation of each argument centers on the evaluation of these two claims. Every argument that you have that you're trying to answer or trying to see if it's correct or valid or sound, you need to answer these two questions. Number one, is the process by which they're arriving at the conclusion, is it valid? And number two, is the information that's placed into the argument, is it correct information or is it true? So we have a factual claim about the information, and the second is an inferential claim. Now, in evaluating an argument, we have to evaluate both of these claims. And for instance, when we were looking at the sum of the ages, the valid process was to add the ages. Now, in one instance, we subtracted them. And of course, we even got the right answer in one instance. All right. But the most important of these two claims is the inferential claim. Why? Well, Hurley tells you the most important of these two is the inferential claim, because if the premises fail to support the conclusion, an argument's worthless. It's a worthless argument. Doesn't prove anything. So if we were subtracting when we ought to be adding, even if we got the right answer, that's just an accident. It's not going to prove it. We didn't prove it by that process. So we always test the inferential claim, which means we have to understand how to reason properly and what good, sound, proper reasoning is. And then we test the inferential claim first, and only if the premises do support the conclusion will we test the accuracy of the information, the factual claim. And that is the claim that the premises present genuine evidence or are true. Thus, a valid deductive argument is an argument such as if the premises were assumed true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. Conversely, an invalid deductive argument is a deductive argument such that if the premises are assumed true, it's possible the conclusion is to be false. It might not be false, as we showed when we subtracted. We had the wrong ages. We put some other bad information in as well. We subtracted, we got the right sum of their ages. We assumed that Joe was 20 and Sue was 5. We subtracted instead of added. We got 15, which was the sum of their ages, the correct sum. Now, let me point out here. Let me give you a scenario from a legal standpoint. It would be totally useless to decide whether my son, Brent, killed President Kennedy. Why? Because President Kennedy was murdered in 1963, and my son was born in 1968. So it's totally useless to see it. to argue that someone who hadn't been born yet is performed a murder is ludicrous. And so the argumentation, the reasoning would be fallacious. He couldn't have done it because he wasn't alive at that time. And so we could get, if we once show that the basic premises is false, and even if you proved that he had been alive, you might argue that Marion was alive, and I was alive at that time. I was in the Navy. But you'd still have to prove I was there to prove that I had murdered him, which I wasn't, of course. But so we need to be very careful that we always have a good argument. The reasoning is correct. So we have to look at validity. That means that's why we need to study what a valid argument is. And we're going to see the difference between validity and soundness. Now, with the mathematics, we showed it. The valid process to get the sum of their ages was to add. In a simple sense, that simply showed the difference. And a sound argument was to be to add the correct ages, and you'll get the sum of their ages. Now, validity, according to Barker, is to say that an argument is valid to say that its conclusion logically follows from its premise as the argument claims. A deductive argument is valid if and only if. Now, that has a special meaning, which we'll get into later. The relation between the premises and conclusion is such that truth to premises would strictly guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Right? And we'll expand upon this more as we develop this. It's very important that we understand this. Now, Copey says, he defines valid as a deductive argument is valid when its premises, if true, do provide conclusive grounds for its conclusion. That is, when premises and conclusion are so related that it is absolutely impossible for the premises to be true, thus conclusion is true also. Every deductive argument is either valid or invalid. The task of deductive logic is to clarify the nature of the relation between premises and conclusion in valid arguments, thus to allow us to discriminate valid from invalid arguments. Remember, Hurley told us the first thing you do is see if it's valid or invalid, because if it's invalid, it's worthless. And then you look at the truthfulness of the premises, what the claims, see if they're factual. Now, a person had to be alive to kill President Kennedy. The arguments that you might make about it, he's a hunter, he's a good shot, and other things you might have argued about him were totally worthless because he wasn't even alive. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? It would be a ludicrous argument to make, and if a court even a judge ought to laugh at it and kick him out of court and fine him for wasting the court's time. Okay. All right. Let's look at how arguments are framed. Here's a problem we run into. We're going to look at the Bible and be looking at arguments in the Bible and developing arguments from the Bible to establish points or what we need to know or what we want to know about something. Argument has two basic parts. There's evidence and the conclusion. There are three basic forms of arguments, and they're arranged according to the order of evidence and the conclusion. And here are your three basic forms. And when you get into the Bible, you may see any one of these three forms, and you have to look at it and evaluate it so you can frame it in a proper form for an argument to understand it, to see the validity of it. We have evidence stated first, we have the word therefore, and then we have a conclusion. We may have the conclusion stated first, and then the word because, and then the evidence last. Or the third one may have part of the evidence, and then therefore a conclusion, and then some more evidence. These are your three basic forms you see them in. So when we look at Mark 16, 15 to 16, how is it worded? And what does it mean? What is the evidence? What is the conclusion? So this is critical to understanding what he means. I think we've had a problem. Many preachers don't have it right as they form it, and they get into a problem. And we'll get into that later. Examples of three types of arguments are all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. All right? And that's what we have here. Now, it's the first one. And the second one is Socrates is mortal because all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. That's worded differently. They both say the same thing. And last, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal because he is a man. Now, all three of those propositions worded differently say basically the same thing. And so we need to look at something that's written in the Bible, and we don't always have the order right. Sometimes if we're not careful, we get the order wrong in our proposition. And when we do, we can have fallacious reasoning. We'll see that later as we develop how to put an argument together. Logicians classify fallacies in two different categories, although it's hard to classify them into two categories. But it seems to be good to begin with the categories of fallacies relating to facts and fallacies relating to inferences. And that would kind of be a good broad category, two categories to use. And so we're going to consider fallacies in chapter 10. We're in chapter 2 right now. So it'll be chapter 10 before we look at fallacies in great detail. We'll introduce some fallacies before that, however, keep that in mind. But the whole chapter 10 is on fallacies. Now, when we are answering ontological and axiological questions, remember, ontology is what is real, and axiology is what is valuable. So we can say, is our soul real? Is God real? Was the earth created by God, or has it always been? Those are ontological questions. Axiological questions: what is good? What is evil? And so those are questions. What must I do to be saved, and so forth. So can either deductive or inductive logic, strictly by itself without any other information, answer either ontological or axiological questions? Now, that's a good question. Can logic by itself do that? Well, Copy, page 8, quotes David Hume on the usage of deductive logic to determine axiological question. Now, I believe Hume was an atheist, and what he said was, for example, as he quotes Hume, in a treatise on human nature, David Hume argues, since morals have an influence on the actions and affections, it follows that they cannot be derived from reason. And I want you to stop and look at that. While reason, he means by either deductive or inductive reasoning. In other words, you cannot just with logic alone say murder is wrong. You cannot by logic alone, with nothing else, derive and draw the conclusion that lying is wrong or stealing is wrong. Can't do that. Now, you have to have some other grounds for determining it. Now, we're going to go back and start at the beginning of the paragraph. Since morals have an influence on the actions and affections, it follows that they cannot be derived. And he abbreviated it from reason. And that because reason alone, as we have already proved, and he abbreviated that, can never have any such influence. So Hume, an atheist, agrees you can't, with reasoning, determine anything is right or wrong. If all you got is reasoning, you don't have any other information to put into it. And I agree with him. We have to go to God's word to determine right and wrong. That's my conclusion. That's the only source. Neither can inductive reasoning, because remember the scientific method is based on inductive reasoning. The inductive reasoning can answer either axiological or ontological questions. If science is the only way that we know anything, and that's called scientism, and we can look down here, it's putting on number 9, an exaggerated trust in the efficacy of the methods of natural science applied to all areas of investigation as in philosophy and social science and humanities. Now, let me digress just a moment. Our school systems have been taken over by those who have swallowed hook, line, and sinker what was taught by John Dewey. John Dewey, I believe he graduated from Columbia University, but John Dewey was probably a communist, but he was definitely a socialist. And John Dewey was, he claimed to be not an atheist. He denied he was an atheist, but he claimed to be an agnostic, which says, I don't know whether God exists or not. But he taught, and he got our school system to eventually arrive at this conclusion, because his whole system of philosophy of education called pragmatism has totally taken over our school system in the United States, almost totally taken them over. Some of your parochial schools will stand against that, but even some of them have swallowed it. So his view is pragmatism, and he didn't believe that we knew anything except by science. And scientism was his whole basis. And he got logic taken out of the school systems. And then we have a whole bunch of people who don't even know how to reason it. They're just irrational as they can be, because they've been taught irrationalism. Science can't tell you morality. We're going to quote another scientist down here, Richard Dawkins, in a minute. So if science is the only way we know anything, that is, scientism is true, then we have no way of determining ethics, or moral philosophy, or morality. The atheist Richard Dawkins agrees with this point. In the universe of electrons and selfish genes, so notice he says your genes are selfish, mind, physical forces, genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe is precisely properties which we expect. There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but pitiless indifference. There's no good, there's no evil. Nothing is good, nothing is evil. And that's exactly where they stand. And so we have people that have believed that. Stanley quoted Arnold Nash, and I've cited these books in the bibliography of this treatise. He quotes Arnold Nash, also was an atheist. It was moreover claimed, he says, Arnold Nash does, that science has obviously failed to solve the problems of the modern world. Why? But you see, John Dewey got our school systems convinced that science is the only way you know anything, but you can't know right and wrong by science. Let's go back and read this again. It's moreover claimed that science has obviously failed to solve the problems of the modern world, confronted the problems of values. Now that will be axiology, say. It has either remained silent or declared that values are essentially arbitrary and irrational. So right and wrong, good and evil is arbitrary and is irrational. So in other words, what they're saying is that's what science tells you. Because you don't have any, if you think science is the only way you know anything, then you've got a problem, because you can't know anything for certain. Now remember, science, we'll look at it later, inductive reasoning is not something that's certain. It's probably true, but different degrees of probability. So the scientist, if he's into scientism, that is, science is the only way we know anything, then he cannot even know that anything is wrong. He cannot say that to torture and kill a little 2-year-old girl, brutally torture her and kill her brutally, would be wrong, morally wrong. He can't say that because he has no grounds for determining right and wrong. Any questions or comments? I know this is pretty serious, but I have a bunch of this material in my flood book. And let's go into principles of deductive logic. Study of deductive logic has been neglected in the American educational system. Most people who get a PhD degree have not had a single course in deductive logic. The general ignorance of it in the United States. Because of this ignorance, some people are afraid of logic, think it's so difficult, only the most difficult can understand it. Certainly this is not true, but it's been taken out of our school, and we can go back to John Dewey, and it goes back to him and those that followed him, and that he influenced. And he wrote a stack of books that reached up to the ceiling, and he had a tremendous influence, not only in the United States, but the Western world in general. Okay? Now, logic is to be used in our interpretation of the scriptures, and I believe, as we'll show, that virtually every principle of logic is found in the Bible. And I'm going to show that as we develop this. That should be an eye-opener, because if Jesus used a principle of logic, then I know it's sound, it's correct. And if Jesus used it, it's important that we understand it so we can understand what he said and what he did or what he taught. We're not going to attempt to cover all the rules of logic, but we're going to limit it to some rules that relate to hermeneutical principles that help solve some current problems in the church, one of which is understanding the scriptures. There's been error in the church and outside the church cloaked in logic called sophistry. And you can look up what a sophist is, but we won't go into it.
From Smith, Gary, Shen.
Gary, I've got a class going. There's been error cloaked in logic and propagated on interpretation of various passages. And so we're going to try to deal with those as well. Now, we're going to give some information that will help us to be able to see what some of the unsound arguments are and what sound arguments are, so we recognize them. Deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive arguments start with a general truth, a universal truth, and then take a specific application. All right. Whereas inductive takes a specific case and draws a conclusion for everybody from it. They go in the opposite other direction. Now, deductive arguments are truth preserving. If the premises are true and they logically lead to the conclusion, then the conclusion must be true. The conclusion provides no new information that is not already present, at least implicitly in the premises. It's already there, we just got to find it. The test whether a given argument is inductive or deductive by asking, do the premises, reasons given, attempt to lead us to a certainty of a conclusion? If they don't attempt to lead us to something that's certain, they say it's probably true, then that means it's inductive. But inductive arguments have their place, but we'll look at them later. We have a whole chapter on it later. All right, so we'll deal with that at a later time. Now, we have what we call propositional logic. Now, we need to define what a proposition is. The word proposition is used by some logicians. Some logicians call a proposition a statement. So what is a proposition? Copey defined the proposition as propositions are either true or false. In this, they differ from questions, commands, and exclamations. So it's a sentence or a statement that is either true or false. We'll illustrate some that are not propositions so you kind of see what some are. Only propositions can be either asserted or denied. Questions can be asked, but you can't say that it's true or false. A question. uh, what is this thing I'm holding right now? It's a computer mouse. You say, so what is it? That's the question. You can't say the question was true or false. All you can say is the answer to the question might have been true or false, but the question itself was not. So questions and commands, exclamations and things of that nature are not propositions. Copy says only propositions can be either asserted or denied. Questions may be asked, commands given, exclamations uttered, but none of them can be affirmed or denied or judged to be either true or false. Hurley defined a proposition as analogously a proposition in a technical sense is the meaning of information content of a statement. So now Hurley uses the word statement and proposition interchangeably. He says for the purpose of this book, however, proposition and statement are used interchangeably. So he uses them interchangeably. So some logicians use the word statement, some use proposition. And Hurley used them interchangeably, showing that they're used the same way. He says a statement is a sentence that's either true or false. So he uses the word statement, Hurley does. So when we have Hurley and he uses the word statement, it's going to be the same as a proposition in copy. I'm going to use the word proposition throughout this book. In other words, typically a declarative sentence. Unlike statement, many sentences cannot be said to be either true or false. He says questions, proposals, suggestions, commands, exclamations usually cannot and so are not usually classified as statements. So Marion Fox would use the term proposition to refer to a statement that's either true or false. That's how I would use it. Now I'll give you a question. We have here in Matthew 11:3. Are you he that should come, or do we look for another? Is that true or false? Well, it's true that Jesus said this was said to Jesus, but it's not the question is not true or false. It can't be true or false. Now it can be answered, and the answer can be true or false, but the question itself is not a proposition because it's not true or false. Now, questions are not propositions. Now, the answer that was given then would be a declarative statement, would be true or false. The proposal, John 11:16. I think it was Thomas that gave this, can't remember, but one of the disciples did. Let us also go that we may die with him. They were thinking Jesus is going to go up to Jerusalem to die, which he did. But John 11:16 is not a proposition because it's a proposal. However, what they did could be easily framed into a proposition, but proposals are not propositions. You can't put it into a logical argument. The command, go into the village over against you, and straightway you shall find an ass tied and a colt with her, loose them and bring them unto me. Matthew 21:2. It's not a proposition. It's not true or false. It's a commandment. However, what the disciples did, whether they went and did this or not, is a proposition. It can be a proposition. We could say the disciples went and loosed the ass and brought it to him. And that would be true or false. That statement would be true or false. But the command to go and do it was not true or false. It was true that Jesus said it, of course, but it's not a commandment is not a proposition. The exclamation, God forbid, which is probably not a good translation of the Greek, may it not be is a better translation. Romans 3:4 is not a proposition. Exclamations are not propositions. The request, my daughter is even now dead, but come and lay thy hand on her and she shall live. Matthew 9:18. It's not a proposition because it's not true or false. It's true that the man said it, but it's not true. The statement itself can't be framed as either being true or false. The request was made, whether it was made or whether Jesus healed her or whether he said it, could be framed as a proposition, but the statement itself, the request, is not a proposition. Last of all, and we have the last, a wish or a desire. I desire to be present with you now. Galatians 4:20 is not a proposition. Neither a wish nor a desire is a proposition, because you can't say it's true or false. Now, whether or not he had the wish, whether he was sincere in his wish, could be true or false. But the wish itself is not true or false, not a proposition. Oh, any questions about that? We may have left out some things that are uncovered here, not covered in this, but hopefully this gets us to see we need to have it in the form of a word or expression, a sentence that is either true or false to be a proposition. There are three laws of thought, and these are important to us. And Copy lists them for us, and other logicians will list them too. Those who have defined logic as the science of the laws of thought, I don't like the word science there, but he's using it, have often gone on to assert that there are exactly three fundamental or basic laws of thought necessary and sufficient. Now, then, the words necessary and sufficient have special meaning in logic, so we'll get to that later. For thinking to follow if it is to be correct. By correct, of course, he means valid, all right, and sound, both valid and sound, right? These have traditionally been called principle of identity, and notice he capitalizes, so that's your first law or principle. Sometimes some logicians call it the law of identity. We're going to try to stay with the term principle. Principle of contradiction, and it could be the law of contradiction. Sometimes it's called the principle or law of non-contradiction by some writers, but they're the same thing. And the principle of excluded middle, or the law of excluded middle, right? Now, so these are your three principles. And they're alternative formulations of these principles appropriate to different contexts. The formulations appropriate here are the following. Principle of identity asserts that if any statement is true, then it's true. All right. Now, that sounds kind of redundant, but we'll expand on it in a few minutes to exactly what he's saying there. The principle of contradiction says no statement can be both true and false. We'll illustrate these with what we mean by those terms in just a minute. Illustration will give us a better feel for what you say. No statement can be both true and false. And we can give an illustration just in a few minutes. Next paragraph has some. The principle of excluded middle asserts that any statement is either true or false. And again, that sounds kind of silly to say it, but it has to be said. All right. So a true statement, if it's a true statement or a proposition, we could say, is either true or false. Since a proposition is either true or false, there's no middle ground. There's no third option between something being true or false. It's what the principle of excluded middle is all about. A statement is either true or it is not true. It is false. For example, either God exists or God does not exist. One of those statements is true. The other one is false. And God, we say the proposition God exists is either true or is false. And of course, I believe, I'm convinced God exists. So it's true. This law or principle is discussed, and I give passages and pages in these various books that I send to you. And you go to those pages and see further illustrations of this law being applied. We won't go through them here. You have this material. Any questions about that? Anybody?
Marion, I do.
Yes.
It says in the paragraph you're in, since a proposition is either true or false, there is no middle ground. But in how a proposition is written dictates to the person that is understanding it to be true or false.
Yeah.
And in a proposition, how am I going to word it? I've been thinking about this since you've been going. In a proposition, if in my understanding, lead one way, and it opposes what the proposition stands for, and the proposition is actually correct. And let's use the simplistic term: does God exist? God does exist. We have scriptures to prove that, but we have to be willing to uphold this proposition to prove this, correct?
Yeah.
And
In fact, we'll have down here just in a paragraph or two, we'll have some other information saying what you're saying. Go ahead, though.
well, when you use the term proposition, my mind automatically goes to that of political, because of the way I have framed this term proposition in my mind. And you state here it's either true or it's false, it's yes or it's no. But that's not necessarily true. In that meaning, what I mean is it's how the proposition is worded when it's given to you for looking for an answer. Am I making sense?
Yes, here's the situation. A proposition is a statement that's either true or false by the nature, by definition. Either God exists or God does not exist. There's no third ground. You can't
Right.
say, well, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. What you're saying is, I don't know. I don't have any knowledge. You're an agnostic when you say that. An atheist says, I know God does not exist. And of course, he is affirming a universal negative, which is ridiculous. Okay. You'd have to be God to know that. So, God,
But
they
since, but
would,
since he stands opposed to that proposition, now it's up to him to affirm what he states as factual, even though it stands against what the proposition is. Correct?
yes.
And,
Uh,
and the and the whole system that he has built his proposition or his answer to the proposition on, if we don't understand where he's coming from, how can we take him to task on this issue?
well, this is what we're going to try to see. We're going to try to learn how we can answer arguments that people make. And that's one of the reasons we will study logic. We'll see when he asserts something, we'll know how to answer him. And we'll show logically how we can answer him.
I was I had just a conversation real quick with the gentleman one time, and I'll make this short. Didn't believe in God, and my question back to him says, then answer a question for me. Where did morality come from? And if he's telling me it came from the mind of man, why would man burden them with such a thing as morality if it came from his own mind? Why?
Well, the problem with that is uh, even most of the atheists don't believe it. That morality, if they're true atheists, they don't believe there is any morality, such thing. There's no such thing. Okay.
Well, that's ignorance on my part because I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. Basically, they don't believe there's any morality. Now, the hedonist says what's morally right is what is pleasurable, good pleasure. But I might be one of those that has pleasure in beating up little 2-year-old girls until they die. Okay. What about somebody killed some people up in Idaho? And I don't know that the man that's been accused is guilty, but he appears he might be. But let's assume he's guilty, just for assumption's sake. Then it was a pretty heinous thing. Did he enjoy doing it? Did he take pleasure in it? If what is good is what is pleasurable is good, if that's what it takes to make something good, then that was a good thing. But I say, as a Christian, it was an evil thing, right? So we'll expand on this more later, Jeff. Is that all right?
Yeah, I'm sorry for interrupting you. I apologize.
Okay. We've got a few more minutes. I want to try to finish one or two more things here before we go. The principle of identity says proposition true, then it is true. For example, if it's true that murder is a sin, then it's always a sin. Okay. But someone might say, well, God looked at his earth creation and saw that it was good. Genesis 1:12, 18, 21, 25, and very good in Genesis 1:31. But he was grieved that he had made them in Genesis 6:7. So you see, it was good, but it wasn't good. Well, of course, there's a lapse of over 1,000 years here of time. And of course, the proposition that God's creation was good was true, and the proposition that earth was corrupt before God was true also, but there's separation of over a millennium of time, more than 1,000 years of time between them. Irrational skeptics have used this as an argument against the inerrancy of the scriptures, falsely claiming posed a contradiction. I think that they're sophomoric. They're like little kindergarten kids, okay, to make that kind of an argument. And they're groping. If they can't make a better argument than that, they ought to stay out of the discussion. The principle of this, no statement can be both true and false. Principal contradiction means that something cannot be both true and false at the same time, in the same manner, and under the same circumstances. The principle with the limits I've set forth is illustrated in the discussion on Genesis 1 and Genesis 6 that we just noted. Now, I want to look at a rule of debate, and it kind of fits into what Jeff said a moment ago. There's a rule of debate. Now, in this course, we'll also have a chapter on debate, and I'm still writing and adding stuff to the book. So whenever we need it, I'll send you another copy of the book. One or two of you got the latest copy here in the last day or so. There's a rule of debate that is closely related to these three rules. We ought to prove what we assert with sound reasoning. That's a rule of debate. Now, debaters agree to this rule, okay? And Freely, a debate book that I took a debate course in college, he says the burden of proof is defined as the risk of the proposition. It is the obligation of the advocates who affirm the proposition to prove their case. That's the standard position in debate. They must provide good and sufficient reasons. Now, the word sufficient is going to be important to us as we define it for adopting the proposition. How does one determine the burden of proof in such cases? The classic burden of proof, rule of burden of proof applies. One who asserts must prove. That's reasonable, okay? Freely, in page 39, Freely goes on and says in page 41, the affirmative, the one advancing an assertion, has the burden of proof. It's his job to prove it. Note that there's a distinction between the burden of proof, notice, the burden of proof and a burden of proof. That this distinction applies to both the judicial and policy perspective. Now, these are different ways of debating. A judicial is more like you'd have in a court, and policy would be more like what we'd have in a religious debate. The burden of proof always rests with the affirmative. He must prove that the proposition should be adopted. However, a burden of proof may rest on either the affirmative or the negative. Whoever introduces an issue or contention into the debate has a burden of proof. If you introduce something into the debate, you've got to prove it. Okay? The advocate must support the argument he or she introduces. Either side may have a burden of refutation, which means if somebody weakens your position greatly, you have an obligation to try to refute their arguments. You can't just ignore them. And that's bad. That's improper debating. It's not the standard rules. A burden rests on the advocate whose case is weakened by an argument advanced by their opponent. That makes sense. So the atheist is obligated to prove, because he says we got here by organic evolution, macroevolution. He's obligated to prove it and to show arguments for it. And of course, once he makes an argument, we're obligated to answer him. And so we should try to answer him and show that his reasoning is fallacious and that his evidence is not good, even if his arguments are valid. It's generally recognized we ought to prove what we assert and not reject what has been reasonably proven to be true. Okay. Now, we're going to look next week, we're in toward the end of the lesson, at types of propositions. This is now where we're getting into logic. All right. Are there any questions anyone has? We'll start here next week. And in my book, my copy, this is page 20. Okay. I think it'll be page 20 in your book. Now, if you look into the lower right-hand, left-hand corner, there's 370 pages in the book now. Some of you may have only 320 or so. So I've added a significant amount of information. I want to go back up here and look at what we have here. Right? We're going to be looking at categorical syllogism on page 38. We're on page 20 next week. And here's all that we're going to look at. Venn diagrams are a way of illustrating things, and I'll have several illustrations. And then we're going to have principle of debate, chapter 14. Inductive logic, we get into the scientific stuff. Right? Now, we'll look at the Greek word translated unto. It's in Acts 2:38. We'll be looking at that. And we'll be looking at, do we have the authentic Bible? That's a question. Is our Bible authentic? Atheists say it's not. If you're looking at Hedges, Rules, Controversy, that's for debate. That's rules for debate. I believe they're real good rules. And we'll be looking at some logical principles, application of them to the new name of God's people. What is the new name? And then we'll look at what a false teacher is to illustrate some other principles of logic. Okay. All right. Any questions? All right. I have something kind of interesting, and I'll go to it, page 354. We'll be through with this. It's kind of funny. So I put it in here. The 10 Commandments of logic. Thou shalt not attack the person's character, but the argument. Okay? Don't spend your time attacking the character of the person, attack his argument. Thou shalt not misrepresent the person's argument in order to make it easier to attack him. That's called the straw man fallacy. And all of these are just applications of various fallacies. Okay? 10 Commandments of logic. Questions? We'll start there next week, and I may be adding more to the book. And what I'm trying to do is find arguments that atheists make and get to them. I intended to have some questions for you, some work to do, but I don't think we're ready for it. I think we'll be ready next week for it. When we get to the types of propositions, we'll be able to add some information in here. Okay. All right. So we probably study about 20 pages, 10 or 15, 20 pages, and be ahead here from page 20 to the end of the chapter probably would be good. All right.